Welcome back once again. Today we are glad to welcome Professor Seth Barbius, who has kindly accepted our request to deliver a special lecture on a very short notice. He is a professor of Dutch variation linguistics at Utrecht University and a senior researcher variationist at the Merton Institute, Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Science. Professor Barbier works on syntactic variation in Dutch and its dialect and specializes on syntactic doubling. He has published numerous articles in reputed journals as well as books, naming some: Locus and Limits of Syntactic Microvariation in Lingua 2009, Syntactic Doubling and the Structure of WH Chains in the Journal of Linguistics 2009, Microvariation in Syntactic Doubling 2008, and many more. Professor Barbius is also responsible for the online research infrastructure such as Dynacent, MeMore, and Edicent. And today he is going to talk about the grammars on the map. With that, I welcome Professor Barbius to the stage to share his expert views on the topic.
Okay, so I'm going to try to bring two worlds together that are usually apart, namely the worlds of dialectology and the world of generative syntax. And the talk will be more programmatic than providing an analysis of a particular syntactic phenomena, because I think that the way my research group tries to carry out this research is constitutes to a certain extent a new program. So I would like to stimulate you to think about that program and think about whether this is something that should be adopted elsewhere. So it is also, it's not just a program, I think, but it's also a new research project that we are carrying out with various universities and the Metis Institute. And the central research question of this program is: what can patterns in the geographic distribution of linguistic properties tell us about the cognitive properties of the language system? Or is it possible to put grammars on the map rather than individual linguistic properties? And from the point of view of generative grammar, this is kind of unusual question, especially in the pre-minimalist era, when we didn't ask questions about the interaction between, let's say, this independent syntactic module and all kinds of external factors. So, and of course, geography is the most external factor that you can imagine. It's much more external than cognitive properties shaping the syntactic module, right? So that's why geographic distribution always has been the domain of dialectology for microvariation, and it has been the domain of typology for macrovariation. People being interested in the geographic distribution, not so much to understand the linguistic systems, but to understand the external history and to reconstruct the history of languages, for example, into a language tree, right? Typological language tree. And so what you find on those maps are typically individual features, sometimes 2 or 3 individual features. So the maps linguistically are usually extremely simple. So for example, you could draw a map of the word orange in the Dutch language area, and you have 4 different words for orange. You have sinaasappel, and you have appelsien, and you have oranjeappel. And then you ask the people, you show them an orange, and you ask, what do you say? And then they say one of these words, and you get the geographic distribution. And it's very hard to come up with interesting linguistic questions about this distribution, right? I mean, I wouldn't know how. But you can do, and people are doing the same things with individual linguistic features at the level of phonology, morphology, and syntax. So you can have a particular syntactic construction, say negative concord, and you check in which areas they do that, and then you have all the areas where they have negative concord. Still linguistically not very interesting. The next step, which would make it linguistically interesting, is if we start to look for correlations between syntactic phenomena, or between syntactic and morphological phenomena. Because then we can make the step from going from individual linguistic features to what I would like to call grammars, right? And then you can ask the question, is that possible at all? Does it make sense to divide a language area into a number of grammars, right? So that is what the program is about. And this is just to show you who is all in this team. There's one person missing, Hans Bennis. And what is important about this research program is that what it seems to require is a special methodology of collecting your data. That's one. And it also seems to require a digital research infrastructure, right? Because we are talking here about projects like the Syntactic Atlas of the Dutch dialects, SAND, where we collected data in 267 dialects of Dutch. And if you, so for those of you who don't know where people speak Dutch, this is the map of Europe, and then we have this tiny little area here, which I think is maybe as big as New Delhi, also in terms of inhabitants. And for this little area here, we investigated 267 different dialects, right? So it's a huge enterprise, and it's also, I mean, it's a difficult enterprise in various ways, also because you often work with political limits that are not linguistic borders, right? So as you can already see here, when you go to the east, the part of North Germany, where they speak dialects that are closely related to the Dutch dialects, right? But when you acquire for funding to do something on the Dutch dialects, you're not going to get funding to do this here. So you have to stop at the border, and that gives enormous complications, because sometimes you can only understand the phenomena if you also investigate these ones, right? So this is where we are, and so given these enormous numbers of dialects and constructions that we are investigating, and given that we are looking for correlations between these properties, it's impossible to avoid setting up a database and putting the database online such that a larger group can work on it and make sure that your database can communicate with statistical programs and that it can communicate with cartographic software, such that it becomes possible to handle the data. So the methodology for these data is clearly different from what most people working within the generative framework are used to, right? Because what you typically do is first you ask yourself, can I say this? This is so-called armchair linguistics. And then you ask your spouse, can you say that? And then you ask a couple of other people, and then you start building your theory, right? But that is impossible when you do the 267 dialects of such a small area. Then you have to set up a systematic methodology, and you have to make sure that all kinds of methodological problems are solved before you ask it. So for example, in the Dutch language area, there is probably not a single person that only speaks his or her dialect. Usually these people also speak the standard variety and a regional variety, depending on many social-linguistic factors. If we still want to believe that at each of these levels there is a system to be discovered, then you have to make sure that you don't get all these systems at the same time, or being code switched all the time. So how are you going to do that? You have to make sure that they speak the local dialect and that they do not accommodate to the language of the researcher. So in our case, we trained, in each location we trained a researcher to become an interviewer and then do the interview in the local dialect without any standard. So it will be clear that this is a huge effort, and it took us 5 or 6 years to do that. So I'm just mentioning SAND here, but there's also what I call GTR, which is even about 600 Dutch dialects at the level of phonological and morphological variation. and these databases have produced printed atlases showing the distribution of the properties. But these printed atlases are, in a sense, traditional dialectological atlases because they just show where you find what without relating the phenomena to each other. And then, so at the bottom of this sheet, you can see that the infrastructure, which we call Mimore, combines all of these databases, comes with one search engine, allows you to search with part of speech tags or combination of part of speech tags, but also with English glosses, and then you can find all relevant data. And since each sentence that we have elicited comes with a location code, you can automatically put your results on the map. Okay, that is what Mimore is doing, and it's completely open and free, so you can go there and look at it, and you can download the data and do what you want to do with it. This is the now, since one side of this program is looking at geographic patterns, I have to point out a number of complications with respect to these geographic patterns. There are various complications. First of all, the pattern that you're going to get on the map very much depends on the level that you're looking at. So if you do an aggregation at the level of all linguistic differences, so you have phonological differences, lexical differences, syntactic differences, you lump them together and you do statistical analysis and then translate the statistical analysis to a geographic map by a process that needs not concern it. It's called multidimensional scaling. Then you get a map that is different from the map that you're going to get if you just look at the syntactic level. And if you go down more levels and you look at the distribution of one or more individual linguistic properties, you still get different patterns on your map, right? So the question is, which of these levels do we need to understand the linguistic system? And then the problem is even more difficult. I will tell you a bit about that shortly. It's also not sufficient to look at the superficial phenomena that we detect. Sometimes you have to have a deeper level of analysis to draw the right map. So it matters, for example, whether you draw a map of phonetic differences or whether you draw a map of phonological difference, as we will see, right? Now this here is just to give you an impression of the language area under consideration. So this is the Netherlands and the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium together. And this is the map that you get when you look at all the syntactic differences that we have found, right? So you can clearly see that there are areas that are kind of distinct. So this is French Flanders. This is actually part of France. West Flanders, East Flanders kind of go together. And then we move into the Brabantish area. We have a separate area here called the Limburgian area, and then in the north it's still really different. And interestingly, people have intuitions about the division of the map. So that's another cognitive level that we could study. So the map on the right-hand side is not the result of looking at linguistic properties, but is the result of asking speakers, could you draw an arrow from your location to the surrounding locations where they speak the same dialect or a similar dialect? If you ask people to do that, then you end up with the right-hand map. And as you can see, there are quite some similarities between people's intuitions and the map that results from the analysis of syntactic lumping together all syntactic differences. Now, however, once you start looking at individual properties like complementizer agreement, so the phenomenon that you find in many dialects of Dutch and German, that it's not just the finite verb that agrees with the subject for person and number, but it's also the complementizer that agrees with the subject for person and or number. And if you look at the blue map To the right, you can see that for this particular feature, we get a different distribution, right? This is no longer the same distribution, because now the same color means yes complementarizer agreement or no complementarizer agreement. So the lighter blue, the area, the fewer locations that have complementarizer agreement. So all of a sudden now there is a central corridor in the language area that have the same property, but and on the left-hand side there is no real central corridor in this sense. And the right-hand map is completely misleading, because so I'm trying to stress that you have to really find out which level you have to look at, because I'm looking at the level of complementarizer agreement. But once I start to differentiate the phenomenon of complementarizer agreement, the map is completely different. Compare these two, and you will see that the map on the right-hand side now looks at the details of the complementarizer agreement. And in the southwestern part of the language area, we now have a system where you have person and number agreement for almost for the full paradigm, right? Whereas in the northeast and in the southeast, we have a system where you only have complementarizer agreement in the second person, right? And then in the middle, we have a couple of dialects where you only have complementarizer agreement in the plural, right? So we are not allowed to, we should not be allowed to look at a map showing the distribution of complementarizer agreement. We should look at the types of complementarizer agreement that you actually have. And this map actually also shows, illustrates what I was saying in the beginning, that it's really unfortunate that we are limited to the Dutch language area, because look at those two green areas, the northeast and the southeast, which have second person singular. And one question that immediately comes up is, are these the same systems? And if so, why are they so far away from each other? Why are they not connected, right? And my hypothesis is that they actually are connected, but they are connected in the German language area, right? So all the way along the eastern border, they are connected. So this should be enough reason to say we have to set up this kind of systematic surveys for each language area. That's actually what we try to do in a European dialect syntax project, which you can also find the infrastructure of on the web. So now, these days, there are various projects in German being carried out that may fill this gap in our knowledge. Okay? Then there is a further complication with respect to geography, such that not all syntactic variables have a geographic distribution. Some have a colloquial distribution. This is an example of this. WH doubling, so sentences of the type, who do you think who I met? Where English would have, who do you think that I met, right? So we have the who twice. And we haven't been able to discover any geographic patterning in this. Some people say it in one location, people may disagree. People may deny that they do it, and then 5 minutes later they use it, right? So I mean, all kinds of complications. So not all syntactic variation corresponds to geographic distribution. Now, then, at the deepest level, so probably the most important complication is most easily, I can easily illustrate with a phonology. So for phonology, the distinction for phonology and phonetics, as you all know, phonetics looks at the differences at the surface level, whereas phonology looks at distinctive features, right? So whether or not a particular property of a sound is playing a role in that system, a distinctive role in that system, right? And so this was already an idea that Weinreich in 1954 promoted, where so the title of that paper is a structuralist dialectology possible? Why was he asking this question? Well, in structuralism, the idea was actually you cannot compare dialects or languages with each other, because every dialect and language has its own system, right? So you have to look at the relations between, in this case, the sounds within one system. You cannot say the A in man in dialect 1 is necessarily the same A as man in dialect 2, because first you have to know whether it's distinctive or not, right? Whether and so he comes with this example here. So he says we have dialect 1 and dialect 2, both have a short vowel A, and then we have dialect 3 and dialect 4, and both have a short but rounded vowel A. Right? So you can easily conclude from that that if we put that on the map, we're going to get an isogloss between dialect 1 and dialect 2 on the one hand, and dialect 3 and dialect 4 on the other hand. Right? However, if we look at distinctiveness, then it may be the case, for example, that dialect 1 actually has an opposition between a short and a long vowel. Dialect in dialect 4, in dialect 3 you have a rounding which is context sensitive but not distinctive. So actually you don't, in the system you don't have a rounded vowel. The rounded vowel shows up in an environment of roundedness. Dialect 2 has a real short vowel A, and dialect 4 has a real rounded vowel A. If that's the analysis, so if we look at the oppositions in the system, we are going to get a distinct map. So these are the two maps that are going to result from phonetic analysis and a phonological analysis. So in the first case, we will have an isogloss between the dialects that have A and rounded A, and in the second case, we will have an isogloss. We will have various isoglosses. These are the dialects that only have a rounded vowel. These are the dialects that have a non-distinctive feature, and these are the dialects that have a distinct. Right? So it matters. Your analysis matters for the map that you're going to get. Now, what are the questions of this program, of this project? Which linguistic regions can we identify, and how? Do linguistic regions correspond to different grammatical systems, that is, sets of systematically interrelated elements and rules, or perhaps constraints if you want to go for optimality theory? Is clustering of linguistic features perhaps sometimes due to extra-linguistic features, historical accidents, settlement history, and so on? If so, how are we going to distinguish those from the correlations in two, so the linguistically systematic and the historical external correlations? And also you can ask the question, does this whole thing shed light on the debate between usage-based and generative linguistics? Because in generative linguistics we expect all kinds of properties to be interrelated, but in construction grammar or usage-based grammar, remember that there everything is a construction. So from the phoneme up to the idioms and the collocations and the phrases, everything is a construction. So in that approach, constructions could have a geographic distribution. A particular construction can have a geographic distribution which is completely independent from other properties of the language. Right? That's something we would not expect to happen in a generative approach. So what do we plan to do in this project? We plan to do a quantitative analysis of our material to detect the clusters of correlating properties. Then we want to do spatial statistics to detect which regions, linguistic regions, we are actually talking about. Next, and that will be really central to the project, we would like to identify special geographic patterns, such as transition zones, so where two or more dialects meet, but also geographic inclusion relations or accessibility hierarchies. I will give an example later on. And then we will, of course, try to do theoretical and syntactic and phonological analysis of these regions and see how these regions, these grammars or partial grammars, can be best modeled. Right? Can you model that variation in terms of minimalist, say the interaction between fixed syntactic principles and interface conditions, phonology, lexicon, or is it better or more accurate to model these systems in terms of optimality theory? And then, of course, we would like to say, once we have done that, we would like to make the final step and see if we have to re-visualize the results, just like I did with that example by Weinreich, right? So first you have the superficial phonetic analysis and you get a particular division of the map. Then you do the phonological analysis, you get a different division of the map. So we expect that to happen for the syntactic or the morphosyntactic variation as well. First you do the superficial analysis on the basis of individual features, and then you do you depict grammars or pathogrammars on the map. So one of the properties that we would like to study is our so-called accessibility hierarchies. That is the situation that these are cases in which you have implicational relations of the type: if a dialect has A, then it also has B, C, and D. If it has B, then it has C and D. If it has C, then it has D, but not the other way around. Okay. An example of this is verb cluster interruption in Dutch languages. Verb cluster interruption is the following. So all verbs in Dutch go at the end of the clause, and sometimes in certain dialects you can have interruption by various types of constituents. For example, an indefinite object, as on this slide. So the dialects would have two, with a book between must and read, whereas the standard language would have one. And as you can see on this map, or should be able to see on this map, is that there is a core area, the southwestern part of the language area, where they have this massively for many different types of cluster interrupters: indefinite objects, indefinite prepositional phrases, manner adverbs, but not higher adverbs. So at least 7 different types of constituents can go there. And when you move out of the area, you lose certain syntactic constituents that can go there, right? So that's a case of the implicational relations that I just gave you, right? So downstairs they have them all. If you go out, you lose certain of these things. And we have found quite some implications of that type in our language area that I can't go into now, but that I will discuss in my classes. Now, the next interesting domain is so-called transition areas. And there we have as a central idea, so the question, of course, is there, what's happening in transition areas? Are people bilingual there, or bilectal? So do they have two, or multilectal? Do they have more dialects in their head? Or is it the case that they have a combination of the two? Or is it or should we characterize this differently? And what we think is that the distinction that is on the slide now is a very crucial distinction. So in generative grammar, we are used to saying that something is grammatical or it's ungrammatical. In phonotaxis and the lexicon, we are also used to saying that something may be realized or unrealized. So take the phonotactic systems, you have your system of sounds, you have the combinatoric principles, and you can generate words that are not part of the lexicon, right? So your phonotactic system overgenerates. That is, and so only part of the words that are possible in that in a language will be actually realized in the lexicon. That's a matter of conventionalization, right? And everybody will accept that for the phonotaxis that plays a role in the lexicon. Now we are claiming that the same phenomena happens in syntax. So the syntactic system overgenerates, and each dialect picks its choice from the set of possible constructions. And then you get interesting combinations. So plus grammatical and plus realized is not very interesting, because that's the common situation, right? Minus grammatical and minus realized is also not very interesting. But plus grammatical and minus realized is interesting, because that gives you the possibility to explain part of the syntactic variation as a matter of conventionalization. So you find possible structures that not all dialects have in the language, but they could have had it. And actually we have research now that shows that people in the Dutch, so I'm talking about verb clusters now, the must, can, swim clusters, where you potentially could have 6 different orders, but 2 are systematically ruled out. So there are 4 left, and out of these 4, each dialect picks 1, 2, 3, or sometimes even 4. Right? So what is the difference between these dialects? Do they have different grammars? The answer is no, they all have the same grammar, and the difference between what they pick is due to conventionalization. If that is true, then you expect that all Dutch people, regardless of which dialect they speak, have judgments about the structures that are possible in their dialect, but that are not realized in the dialect, right? And at the same time, of course, you expect all speakers of Dutch dialects to reject the one that are systematically impossible. Both predictions are right. So we asked people to rank the logically possible 6 orders. So not to say this grammatical or ungrammatical, but simply say put the best on top and put the worst down. And then what you get is, the result that you get is that this replicates the distribution. This replicates the distribution that you find on the map. So people have intuitions about. Can I take 1 more minute to finish? Yeah. So people have intuitions about structures that are actually not there in their dialects, right? Which I think is a piece of evidence in favor of this distinction in terms of plus grammatical minus realized. The other one is equally interesting because there we have a case of a phenomenon that is not grammatical but is realized nevertheless. And we think that that happens in unstable geographic areas, transition zones, but also in unstable time zones when a dialect develops into another dialect, right? So an example of this would be strong reflexives in Dutch, where we have many different strong reflexives in Dutch. You have his own, you have zichzelf, you have himself, and so on. And we never found zich own until a student came up and with a number of internet observations showing that this particular form only arises in transitional areas. And I could show you, but the time is up, that it's actually ungrammatical to have zich own. So we predict those to be rare and unstable. So we are particularly looking at transitional areas for phenomena that violate syntactic principles, but that are there nevertheless, right? To get an idea of how transition zones work. This you can all ask later on. Finally, well, I actually discussed all these questions that are in the final project as well, and already indicated that you, in addition to normal generative analysis, you also need quantitative analysis to do this kind of things. Summarizing, what I think is needed is, for as many language areas as possible, systematic exploration of the syntactic, morphosyntactic differences, put them in a research infrastructure, do quantitative and theoretical analysis of them, put them on the map, then investigate the relation between what you see on the map and the linguistic system, and then these are all preconditions, in addition to the special methodology to collect the data, to be able to set up a decent model of morphosyntactic variation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barbius, for the interesting talk. Now the floor is open for questions.
Okay. I was particularly interested in this phenomenon of interruptions of verb clusters, because the received wisdom is that when the verbs cluster at the end of the clause in the SOV pattern, they cannot be interrupted. Mm-hmm. And there is a very interesting data from Hungarian, which Zabolci and Koopman discuss, etc. And in fact, I have attempted an explanation of it. So yeah, I would be very interested in seeing your data of the violations of that prediction.
Right.
Okay. Do you have any papers and things like that?
Yeah. So we are working. So somebody is giving a paper right now at UPenn. This is a joint paper by the person is Lotte Hendricks, a PhD student in my project, together with yeah, and so I can send you the handout of that paper. In that paper, we are actually investigating how to explain the fact that if you move out of that core area where you have 7 different types of constituents that can occur in the cluster, when you move out, that you get different, that you lose several of these types. And it seems so various factors seem to play a role in addition to syntactic factors of, let's say, of the Cinque functional sequence type, where you can, for example, you can see the higher an adverb is in the Cinque hierarchy, the less likely it is that it's going to occur inside this cluster. You're probably not surprised,
Okay.
right?
And why is it that when it's a noun phrase which interrupts, it's
Yes.
always indefinites?
There's a strong preference for indefinites. So there is an
Yes.
interaction. There's an interaction with, let's say, the scrambling phenomenon in the language.
Yes,
that if it's
precisely.
definite,
That
then
is
you move it
because
on.
object shifting
Right.
shows the same sensitivity to
Right.
definite specificity.
Right. And then there are additional factors which we don't know how to account for. So, for example, we have looked at length of the constituents. So
Mhm.
the length in terms of syllables doesn't seem to matter,
I
but
see.
the length in terms of syntactic sub-constituents does seem to matter.
Okay.
Even if the entire constituent has the same function.
Hmm.
So for that reason, we also discuss processing explanations of these intuitions that people have, because for this construction it also holds that people outside of the area have intuitions about the constructions that they don't have in their own language. So that possible explanation could be processing, but the processing analysis that are on the market, if we apply them to this construction, they all fail. So, for example, the Hawkins, you know,
I know.
Hawkins fails. But there's the other one that, well, various proposals are there, and which are actually quite precise, and they all fail.
Yeah, processing won't succeed. That's my intuition.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
what I have tried to do is give a syntactic explanation of it. And I
Okay.
would,
I would
be
like to see it.
very
I would like to
interested in seeing the exceptions to that.
Okay.
Okay, so I have two very brief questions. I mean, quick questions, but I'll also try to keep them brief. One is, as far as I understood, your maps, depending, I mean, let's assume you take up any particular syntactic construction, like the complementizer agreement cases that
Yes.
you were talking about. Your maps seem to differ depending on whether you're doing a macro, a construction level analysis comparison, or let's say a micro feature level analysis, right? Similarly for the phonemic studies. And I was wondering, if that is true, then what is the relevance? Actually, how do you then start comparing system X and Y and saying that they are similar or different? Because it seems like the comparison is actually theory driven, right? And if that is true, then maybe the grammars are there not on the map, but actually in the theories. And in the theories,
Yes.
right? And if the theories are nothing but knowledge of language, then the grammars are back to the mind of the individual.
Yeah.
So that's question number one. Question number two
Shall I
is
answer
okay,
this
sure.
one first?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I will have forgotten it. Yeah, this is a very good question, of course. So, just like it is impossible to assign parts of speech tagging to sentences without analyzing the sentences, it is in fact impossible to put linguistic features on a map in a theory neutral way, right? I mean, putting aside the orange cases where you can obviously do that. So yeah, so you are right. That is a problem. And that's actually a huge problem. And that's why I think that we need theoretical approaches and quantitative approaches at the same time in a complementary way, but although also feeding into each other. And of course, you can make both type of approaches. You can make decisions about the levels that you're going to analyze. So what I could do in a quantitative approach, I could say, I count complementizer agreement as one value, so it's plus or minus. Or I could say, I count a particular member of the paradigm as one value, right? So you have, so I think in order to avoid these problems, you have to make a very fine-grained analysis, because that will increase the chance that you're going to end up with the right correlations.
Very quickly, because I'm sure there are questions there. You talked about overgeneration by UG, out of which
Yes.
dialects select, but but the case that you took up, which is basically where you have the multiple complementizers, that if where you have these three possible C's one after the other, or a WH,
Two.
yeah, and then dialects
And a
choose out
WH,
of that.
yeah.
But I thought your analysis had UG produce all three, right?
Yes.
So a structure where you have all three, and then at PF a dialect can decide
Yes.
which one to delete. So is it UG over generating, or is it Paroma's PF doing the job?
No. Oh yeah, okay. Is it Paroma's? Okay. So I think so. No, my hypothesis is, or the hypothesis that is central to my work, is that the syntax is always the same in each and every language. There's no difference whatsoever. I'm not sure that I like to follow the present day assumption that syntax is only merged. I think that's still in the debate. I think probably that will make that module a bit too poor. But whatever principles are there, they are fixed for all languages. There are no parameters in the syntactic module. That is the central assumption. So when I say that the grammar overgenerates, what I mean is there are particular configurations that are delivered by syntax and then have to be interpreted at PF. And in particular, when these configurations show a certain amount of redundancy, for example, features are being repeated or complete morphemes are repeated, and they are in a sufficiently local configuration, then PF is going to get rid of one of them, or partially get rid of them. So the overgeneration does not apply to the syntax in the sense that the syntax would be able to generate different structures for one and the same construction. Or the structure will always be the same, but the PF interpretation is going to vary. And most of what I've shown should then be considered to be a kind of PF variation.
Okay, I hope I understood this point clearly, but so at one point I think you said that if imagine there are 4 different regions and in a particular area, and each of at a superficial level those 4 different regions show different features in a particular whichever linguistic phenomenon one starts to study. But then when one looks at it closer, it's not true. I mean it's not true that there is so much of diversity in terms of features. They kind of are similar in certain ways. There isn't as much of a diversity as it seems to be on a superficial level. So I was just wondering that if are you really saying that these seemingly different regions actually have the same underlying grammar, and it is because of geography as an external factor that we see the diversity? And also I was thinking of this external factor in terms of the three factors of language design. And so in terms of those 3 factors of language design, where would geography fit in, and how far can we push the second factor among those 3 factors? And because this is really pushing it to really external factors.
Right. Yeah. So the geography is the most external factor that you can imagine. Right? So I think the case of the verb clusters, so the word order variation in the must, can, swim order, and the fact that all speakers of Dutch come up with the same ranking when you ask them to rank the 6 logically possible orders, is a strong indication that they all have the same grammar, right? Yeah. As a matter of fact, I can push this one step further, because there is a big multilingual festival in Amsterdam every year, and then we have a kind of public laboratory, and we have on our computer the question, could you rank these orders? But I mean, this is Amsterdam, so people from 150 different countries are living there, so also foreigners are doing that, who speak a little bit of Dutch, have been speaking Dutch for half a year. And we ask them, could you do this? And even those people, which do not have verb clusters in their language come up with the same ranking, right? This, so for example, people from Georgia in Eastern Europe. So I think these are all strong indications that that they all have the same grammar, right? So for these cases as well, so they have the same syntax, they have the same intuitions about what is possible, what is impossible, but they don't have. So the dialect speakers, or people from different areas in the Netherlands, differ with respect to which of these orders they actually use, right? So there are 4 grammatical orders for a particular type of cluster, and then you have a dialect that uses 1, and you have a dialect that uses 2, and so on and so forth. And indeed, I would like to say that the choice there, so actually this is also a PF phenomenon, as we will see during my course, because it has to do with roll-up and then deciding which copy you're going to spell out. And then this decision is which one you're going to spell out is entirely geographical, where geography is just one of the possible social linguistic factors, right? Because geography, of course, determines a certain social space. And it happens to be the case that people who live together start to look like each other and start to talk like each other, right? And that's a fact of life, which even happens if you move to a different area later in life. You still adapt to it, right? So given that this is a PF, a spell-out kind of phenomenon, this is going to be determined by your social environment, and a kid that grows up in a particular environment is going to use those orders that happen to be used in his or her environment. So I guess the answer is yes. Third factors to the third factors also the social linguistic factors belong. But note that there is an important problem with this if we look at it from the traditional generative grammar point of view, because in traditional grammar we always said we are not going to memorize constructions. We generate them from primitive elements and combinatorial principles, right? What I'm saying is that there is a certain amount of conventionalization at the higher level, at the level of these word orders. And that, so getting closer to construction grammar, but I mean, it's still far from it, of course, but getting closer to construction grammar in that sense. And I don't think, once you start to think about it, even in generative grammar is no longer a real problem, because think of all these proposals of the past 20 or 30 years where people say that what looks like an individual lexical element is actually a phrase. So take work by Hale and Kaiser and Gillian Ramchand and many, many other people on the structure of verbs. It's not the case that the verb is a single element in the lexicon. It's a whole chunk, right, which shows you who's the initiator, who's the experiencer, and so on and so forth. And that also holds, for example, for the analysis of pronouns in the past 20 years, right? They're all phrasal, right? So we have to allow phrases or larger structures in the lexicon anyway, beyond what we already needed, namely idioms, right? So given that situation, I don't think it's a very controversial step to say that conventionalization of a phrasal structure is needed anyway in the theory. So then we might as well do this for the verb clusters as well, right?
Yeah, I have a very short question. I was really surprised by this minus grammatical and plus realized category when you first showed that slide itself. So, and I was wondering what would that be? And that is because given our understanding in generative linguistics, either the structure crashes if it does not get realized, or it can be read and so it's something that how can you build a structure? So there was this factor over there, surprise factor over there, but when you explained it and you said that this is localized to certain regions which are the in between transitional regions between dialects, when you said So there is a certain degree of transgressiveness that you're saying in these areas. You're locating it in a map, this particular characteristic. So I was wondering if this, and like what you told right now, Gurmeet, that this has to, maybe there is structure and then there is interpretation, and in that sense, so would you expect to find, or is there any data that shows that even in child language acquisition, when children are figuring things out and doing with this, so is there corresponding data from child language which is supporting this kind of idea that it is transitional?
Yeah, actually, so one construction that comes to mind, that was a construction that I discussed yesterday in class, which is which goes as follows. So in Dutch what you have is you have the stem of the verb, and then you have, in the present tense you have agreement, person and number, and in the past tense you have the past tense suffix on the stem, and then followed by plural, right, and no person. Now, there is a stage in child language in which you get constructions of the type then, so I'm doing Dutch now but in English glosses, then, call, I, past tense, you, Santa Claus. So the striking thing is here that the full pronoun, which is supposed to be somewhere a phrase in the spec position, is intervening between the stem of the verb and the tense suffix. And this phenomenon showed up in the language of my daughters when they were like 3 or 4 years old. And I was shocked, of course, because I mean we all hope for the best when it comes to our children. And it happened in a stage in which they stranded other suffixes too, right? And so yesterday I told the people in the class that this is a case in which the tense suffix is actually stranded, and all the other operations are the normal operations, right? And this construction rapidly disappeared from the language of my daughters without me doing anything to make sure that they got rid of it, right? So this would be a candidate, right? Because stranding of a suffix, well, it's a suffix, you're not supposed to strand it because it's a suffix, right? And so we have a paper on this. Mario van Kopper and I have a paper on this where we describe this. And then a colleague of mine, Gert-Jan Postma, tries to extend this to geographical transition zones. So he says, okay, you look at the distribution of these phenomena, you find them here and here, and that is exactly what you expect because they are in transition zones and because they violate the grammatical principle, in this case you are not supposed to strand a suffix, we expect that they are not stable. We expect that in those geographic areas they will also disappear. Or when they are in a certain stage of a language diachronically, that they will be not stable and will disappear. Where disappear can mean disappear entirely, but of course another possibility would be that it is going to be restructured or reinterpreted, right? So I think so, and then it becomes a normal member of the grammar rank.
Yeah, it's working now. Yeah. So another question related to plus minus grammatical, plus minus realized. So is it a matter that the kind of interesting structures that you said, plus grammatical minus realized and minus grammatical plus realized, is it a matter of conflicting grammars in a language under transition, that there are two conflicting dialects?
Yeah. So for the cases minus grammatical plus realized, that seems to be the case. So they are in transition zones, and they typically look as combining properties of two surrounding dialects, right? So the zich eigen, the strong anaphor. So zich is the reflexive, and eigen means own. The zich eigen here, you can actually see it on this map. The zich eigen here, this is the right-hand side map. There you find the distribution of zich eigen. And it happens on the border between the red dialects, which have zichzelf, so the first part is the same, zich, the second part is a different, self, and dialects that have zijn eigen, his possessor, own, right? So these transitional dialects take the first element from one group of dialects and the second element from the other group of dialects and combine them into two. And then there are more examples like that where you get a combination of two, and then the result, in some cases you can show that the result is actually ungrammatical, right? So it's really a case of language contact such that they influence each other, that new variants show up, and these variants are either should either disappear or they should be reanalyzed.
Yeah, for the second,
Yes.
the second kind of phenomenon that we see, that it is plus grammatical minus realized. So is there a trend that certain kinds of structures would finally surface and certain others, plus grammatical minus realized, would be lost? And so is there some UG, internal phenomenon that certain structures would be given preference over others when there are two grammars which are conflicting?
You mean certain, one and the same structure?
Yeah, so there are two languages,
Yes.
language 1, language 2.
Yes.
They have similar phenomenon in each. But then, so if there's a conflict, one of them would win. That would be maybe minus grammatical plus realized for language 1, and it is plus realized and plus grammatical for second language. So is there some sort of trend, maybe simplicity of, I mean, I don't know. So certain constructions would finally win and they would kind of surface for both the languages. So is there some theory internal explanation for why certain structures would like continue while others?
Why certain structures would be unrealized,
Yeah.
even though they are grammatical?
Yeah, grammatical or not. I mean,
Yeah,
they
so
would
for
be
the-
grammatical
so
for
for
the
the
original.
ungrammatical ones, it's clear, right? There's pressure from the system to do something about it. So then we could reduce the question to: is there a preference for certain unrealized but grammatical structures to survive? I have no idea. It could be. I don't know. I haven't thought about it.
Thank you very much, Professor Barbius. I'm really sorry to cut short.